I think the radical contingency of contradiction, antagonistic and non-antagonistic contradiction, means that you don't have to accuse someone who owns a small business of being an exploiter if they use the money for that small business to buy guns for the revolutionaries, right? Or they fund resistance to anti-imperialism. But that's a big difference, right? Because you'll notice that serves the proletariat's interest.
Yeah.
Whereas, for example, Bill Gates' funds are consumptive, right? It's to feed people, it's to save them from malaria, but it's not to in any way alter the relationship of the means of production, right? And again,
and also it doesn't, even if they make these distinctions or try to find some way to salvage class, they at least are still using class, whereas the ultra-leftists and sociologists find their way out of and Hart and Avery find their way out of class.
Yeah.
Right. They in order to say we need to find something besides class.
Exactly. Do you mind if I move on to the?
Yeah.
Did you gentlemen, any of you have questions, objections?
No, we had a good discussion about if there's any.
I've got a few things I'd like to address. Well, certainly there's a lot of, I think, just assumptions about right, orthodox Marxism and all that. And maybe it's too contradictory and multifaceted to get into, but I'm interested, right? So, in light of last week's lecture, right? There's this. I'll just dive right in here, right? So, for Adorno and the whole Frankfurt School at large, right? You've got this. For them, individuality is a very it seems almost sacred thing, which is interesting, right? Well, anyways, but for them, right, the more that notions of individuality get emphasized, specifically in modern Western culture, what that is indicative of is the fact that people's individuality is actually deteriorating to the point it's almost non-existent. And this is tied up in the whole idea, right, that you've got this freedom, but really it's, you know, it's freedom of like brand names and freedom of consumption, but not really like freedom from consumption or freedom from. So anyways, I guess maybe you could address that, but what would be an orthodox? How would an orthodox Marxism begin to exhume notions of individuality versus maybe notions of identity that are more emphasis on like group identity?
Well, I mean, that's an interesting question. To be fair to the Frankfurt School, most of them thought that they were Orthodox Marxists. They saw themselves as Orthodox Marxists who had just reached a wall. They're like, hey, this industrial worker isn't rising up. Marx was wrong or incomplete in this respect, so we've got to do the culture work, right, that is necessary to explain why the proletariat aren't revolutionary. But this is, as I see Orthodox Marxism, this is a deviation. And this is one of the most dangerous deviations that has happened in the history of Marxism. Probably, I would say, more than Stalin, more than Pol Pot, more than any of them. This is the most dangerous deviation that has occurred in Orthodox Marxism, which is this transition from the means of production as the area of focus, right? Because there's an individuality that speaks to the means of production. If you own the means of production, you own the time that you go into work. Maybe not in a free, happy way in which anyone can do anything at any time and we can all eat ice cream, right? But if you own the means of production in a real and substantive way, even if it's through a council, even if it's mediated by the state, you have a level of individuality that one cannot gain regardless of your consumption. The thesis of Orthodox Marxism is even a well cared for and well-fed slave is still a slave. and Adorno and Marcuse and those Western Marxists do a really good job about analyzing how being well-fed, right, and well-treated as a slave makes us want to continue to be slaves. But again, in doing so, they lose sight of the underlying and most important thesis, which is the call to class composition, the call to demand the means of production be in the hands of the workers, which is to say, I and those like me shall not be slaves. So does that answer, or give at least a gesture to answering your question?
It does. If I could maybe tack something onto that. Right, you talk about how this deviation from focusing on the means of production is dangerous. Initially, I mean, to defend them, Adorno, etc., I think the real culprit, though, right, the reason that project was so necessary for them is because, with the exception of the printing press, mass media just wasn't the force in the world that it was during Marx's life, right? Radio and certainly even television, and I think we're seeing the internet being co-opted as well. But right, and for them that was the culprit. That was the reason that people were necessarily misrecognizing their class. So, but I guess the reason I think maybe that's warranted and not so dangerous. What about people whose labor, right, is increasingly becoming, right, in the sort of service sector, and how do you identify these people as, you know, the proletariat?
Well, yeah, actually that's, do you mind if we make this the last question for the sake of moving on to these gentlemen?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Well, this is actually the criticism that I'd have of Adorno and Marcuse. They focus, and of course, I would highly recommend looking into Marxist notions of base superstructure. This is what they're working with. But what they focus on is how workers consume mass media, almost without exception. Their essays are about, I mean, there's in fact an essay which, if I have it correctly, is verbatim, how to watch television. They are focused on, you know, jazz, on movies, on music, on the reproduction of art. That's all consumptive. There are ways in which one can deal with mass media that deal not with mass media as consumption, but mass media as production. And this, of course, right, would extend to the service sector. The key of the service sector is not to pretend that they are a fake part of the economy, right? And to focus on how, you know, being forced to have someone smile and wave at you and greet you at Walmart is affecting your subjectivity. The real question is, how does one liberate the means of production, right? The site of production, in this case of affect, of, you know, distribution, Walmart. How does one liberate that from the service of capital? And so in this case, I think Adorno, and giving Benjamin some exception, and maybe that's just a personal preference, they fail. They are engaged in consumptive analysis, and I think that's a wrong track to take, and I think that's a dangerous deviation. But the history of Western Marxism basically says I'm wrong, so we should include that as well. So, gentlemen.
I was wondering if you were differentiating the last perspective you talked about, the ideological perspective, from Orthodox Marxism, and if you could explain that a little more.
Well, basically, my perspective on ideology is one that it permeates all perspectives. So whether you're engaged in sociology or consumptive analysis, you are always engaged in ideology. So rather than search for this purity from ideology, we assume it as a given and we follow it to its end. Which is, if we have to assume an ideology, which I believe we do, the ideology to assume is Orthodox Marxism in this case, and to follow it to the end, which is the liberation of the means.